Hi everyone, welcome to 40K Podiums, where I go through all of the GTs from the previous month. These are tournaments with 28 or more players, according to the ITC. I then give factions points according to the number of top 3 placings that they get, with the first place being worth more than a third place, and then I aggregate those results so we can get an idea of what the top armies are in the game right now. However, last month, of course, was no normal month, what with the balanced data slate coming out. So, for the purposes of this video, I have split the tournaments, so we're going to have a look at the tournaments that didn't use the new balanced data sheet, and then have a look at the tournaments that did. So, we're not going to spend a massive amount of time on the tournaments from before the balanced data slate, but unsurprisingly, the results look somewhat similar to what we saw last month, with a little bit of rejigging around what was in the first to fourth place. Now interestingly, Adeptus Custodes had a really strong performance over this period, but overwhelmingly it looked like the top 4 factions were going to pull away as they did before. Notably, Grey Knights looked like they were going to do much better than they did in the previous 40k podiums, and very interestingly, they didn't get any changes in the balanced data slate, so you might be able to figure out how this is going to go. And so here we go, this is post-balance, this is what the scores look like except for the top 3 armies, and as you can see, we've had some interesting changes. I think quite notably, Iron Hands and Tyranids are looking really strong. They are both favoured by a lot of the top players around the world. Iron Hands are still proving to be a really fantastic army. Their super doctrine means that Devastator squads are absolutely incredible. They'll get that first turn deep strike, they can fire a load of melter or grav shots at hitting on 3s, re-rolling 1s, very reliable, very effective. They can make their character dreadnoughts, give them warlord traits with 6s allowing you to make another attack, and they can be screened using the company veterans, which means that you simply cannot target that character dreadnought. Interestingly, you normally see Iron Hands as a successor chapter because they want that little bit of extra combat punch that you get from Whirlwind of Rage and Born Heroes. Tyranids, of course, have come out the gate pretty strong with their updated rules in Octarius. Of course, they've got the new Leviathan supplement, and Leviathan is very, very popular because their Hive Guard are absolutely incredible. They've got some new buffs that are really, really powerful, and they've got the new Synapse abilities, which are really flexible and very strong. There is, of course, a lot of bad stuff in that Tyranid book too, but there is just enough good stuff across the GW and Forge World selections that you can make an absolutely incredible competitive 2000 point army. And of course, the other massive change that we can see is Adeptus Mechanicus have dropped right down the standings. The nerfs to them have clearly really hurt them, and they are struggling without that incredible Alpha Strike potential from the planes. As I said in the last 40k podiums, I am so happy with the balanced data slate and just the idea that Games Workshop is going to be balancing the game more regularly. However, the balanced data slate has highlighted 2 problems in my opinion. So the first thing is that it doesn't seem to me that Games Workshop have properly looked at the stats when it came to balancing the factions. So if we have a look at the last 40k podiums, and if you have a look at the win rates for Drukhari and Admech in the months previously, pretty consistently Drukhari were the better performing of the 2 armies. Now Admech might have been the more feel bad of the 2 armies due to their strong Alpha Strike potential, but the idea that you would give far more buffs to Drukhari as opposed to what you would give to Admech doesn't really make sense to me. I would have given Admech more than I gave Drukhari. The second problem that I think this highlights is that I think it needs to be looked at a little more closely as to whether a unit is bad or whether a unit is just overshadowed. So for example, all of these Drukhari units that are now incredibly good for their points, to be fair, you didn't used to see them before, but they still weren't bad, they just weren't as good as Witches in Raiders, etc. So they really didn't need a bunch of points drops. So for example, if we have a look at this Orc Codex, there's a whole bunch of stuff in this Orc Codex that is really good, but doesn't hold a candle to the Orc Buggies, so we don't really see it very often. If we get to the next chapter approved and Games Workshop decides to increase the points on all of the Orc Buggies as we'd expect and drop the points on a bunch of the Orc units, we could end up just seeing a pivot of Orcs in the meta, not actually a balancing of them. And I think this is an example of where I'm a little bit concerned for the future, and I hope they change how they look at the game in this respect. So let's move on then and look at the top 3 placings for last month after the data slate. So in third place, we have the Orcs. The Orcs are still incredibly good. We're still seeing a lot of buggies, mainly 3 of the same type. So we've got the Scrapjets, the Squig buggies, and the Dragsters being the most popular flavours, and they normally come as freebooters. They're often backed up by the planes. These are all still really good units. Taking 3 squads of Squig buggies was preferred before, however these are definitely not a bad option. A war bike or war trike seems to be a go-to option for a warlord nowadays, usually taking brutal but cunning, so they get that ability where each time they don't inflict damage, they can make another attack. The Orcs also have access to a few very good units to play the mission, so we've got Commandos and we've got Store Boys, which we've all seen a lot of recently, and then we can take things like Deathcopters or single units of vehicles to get even more points. There's actually a really nice amount of variety that we're seeing at the moment. And now that Orc players are limited on the buggies they can take, we are starting to see some of the go-to units people thought Orc players were going to take when the Codex drops, so things like Kill Rigs and War Bikers are starting to see more play. One thing that's quite interesting to me is the lack of Orc stuff from the Octarius book, so we haven't seen a lot of Blood Axes and we haven't seen a lot of Speedoir, and so it's interesting to see that Orc players don't seem to be going that way for competitive play. On to second place, which is Drukhari. The mean click in the Eldar High School is doing incredibly well, even still post-balanced data slate. They got a bunch of points drops, as I mentioned, which have kept them in the game, as it were. Most notably, Richard Siegler won the US Open in Austin, and he did so with what has now been referred to as Thick City. He's got Grotesques in this list. They are incredibly tough to deal with, answering Drukhari's main problem, which is that they're quite easy to kill. He's also got a whole bunch of Talos and Kronos in this list. The Kronos sit in Dark Technomancers, so they can get flat 3 damage on 6s to wound on their auto-hitting weapons, and the Talos are really good as Artists of Flesh because they get access to that -1 damage, which makes them incredibly tough to shift. Those are the main changes that we're starting to see. Of course, they're supported by the Homunculus. There's a lot more racks in the meta nowadays. We've got the Cult of the Archon still knocking about some of the support units like Mandrakes, for example, but overall, there's been a big pivot in the way Drukhari players have made their armies. If you are a Drukhari player and you want to still try and play one of the old style lists, that's still not a terrible list in the current meta. There's normally more Ravagers switched in over the Raiders, but you can still do really well pretty much with anything in that book except for the Beasts. And so, on to the number 1 spot for last month. It is the Grey Knights. Unsurprisingly, they have done incredibly well coming from Titan to make a massive dent in the meta. I think they've got quite a low barrier to entry for the faction because they're obviously quite easy to paint, it's not a massive amount of models, and actually they're a pretty simple army to play compared to a lot of stuff in the meta nowadays, what with the main considerations being 2 main units. It is of course still Interceptors and Dread Knights that are doing most of the heavy lifting for the Grey Knights. We haven't seen a massive change in the way armies have been composed. The Grandmasters and Nemesis Dread Knights are incredibly strong. They can teleport across the battlefield when they're shot, they can get access to that 3-up invuln, and of course their supporting psychic powers are really good. Swordbearers and Prescient Brethren seem to be great options for the Nemesis Dread Knights, and Rapier seems to be pretty good because you can use that stratagem to buff all of those attacks from the Interceptors. I'd really like to talk more about some of the other units from that book, so Purifiers and Castellan Crow are popping up a little bit, but overwhelmingly it is still the Interceptors and Dread Knights. And so that gives us our first, second and third place for the meta in November. I think it's pretty interesting. If we add those to the table, we can see the meta doesn't look terribly unbalanced, and it will be interesting to see if Iron Hands and Tyranids can make a bigger dent in the meta for next month. I think Tyranids especially might be able to go a much further distance because of course a lot of players haven't had a lot of time to practice with the new rules. I'm also not quite ready to write Admech out of being one of the better armies in the game just yet. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, it definitely seems like a lot of the top players in the game abandoned Admech, and so that's of course affected their win rate. But the other thing is that that book is quite deep, often touted as one of the most complicated books in 9th edition, and so that does suggest to me that there's a good chance there will be some powerful things that top players will be able to identify and utilise to great effect. Previously there were non-traditional Admech lists that were doing well, things like Metallica, taking more combat units, etc. I still think they might have a lot to offer in the game. I'll be interested to see in the comments actually whether you AdMech players agree with this or whether you think you've just been nerfed into the dirt. And that's everything that I wanted to cover in this video. I didn't want to make this video too long because of course we've had to split the month into two. I hope you have found this really useful though, and it's given you a good indication of what are the top armies in the game right now. If you do like this content and feel like liking and subscribing, that would be fantastic. Some of you have already noticed there is a join button on the page now if you would like to support the channel even further. That will give you access to the new Discord, which is called the Sandcastle, because I'm hilarious. And the aim of the Discord is to provide a place for anybody who needs help preparing for their games. If you're not sure what your opponents can do in the matchup, if you drop a message, we will always get back to you and help you prepare for those games. That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you for the next video.